arcade version of Miss Pac-Man was released in 1982 as a sequel to the hit game Pac-Man. The game is considered to be the most successful American-produced arcade game. Other than a bow added and the mazes changed, there are numerous small tweaks made to the original Pac-Man formula that, in my opinion, makes the game better than Pac-Man. Due to the incredible popularity of the arcade version of Miss Pac-Man, the game was ported to a number of home consoles. Let's take a look at a few of the earlier ports of the game and figure out which one's best. The Atari 2600 had a port of Miss Pac-Man that was released in 1983. The game is a drastic improvement over the Atari 26 version of Pac-Man. However, it does feature the signature ghost flicker, which can be painful to look at. Despite running at a really low resolution, the maze actually does somewhat resemble the arcade version of the maze. However, it's highly distorted. You can't really play this version to practice the arcade version because it doesn't really resemble at all due to the maze and the dumb AI. This port is actually really playable for a 2600 game, and it actually won Video Game of the Year in 1983. 7 years later, in 1990, Miss Pac-Man made its debut on the Nintendo Entertainment System when Tengen, who was owned by Atari, released a port of the game. This was not a licensed Nintendo game, and it came in one of the black Tengen cartridges. The port would also become the basis for the Genesis, Master System, and Super Nintendo versions that would later be released. The Tengen version of Miss Pac-Man added numerous new features to the game, such as new maze sets, a turbo boost, as well as difficulty settings. One thing about this version that's instantly noticeable is that on the standard arcade mode, you can't see the entire maze at once, forcing it to scroll up and down when you get to the top or bottom of the maze. This unfortunately was the only way to get a true full-screen Miss Pac-Man experience on a home console, because the arcade version of Miss Pac-Man had a vertically mounted screen. These ports also tend to move slower than their arcade counterparts. However, by using the Pac Booster, you can get the speed closer to what it feels like when you're playing in the arcade. However, it doesn't affect the speed of the ghosts, so it does make it a little bit easier than it would be in the arcade, creating a slightly different experience. The ghosts in these versions finally behave as they would in the arcade version, and have pretty much the same AI as the original arcade game. Between the NES and SNES versions of Miss Pac-Man, there's not really much of a difference. The graphics are slightly enhanced on the Super Nintendo version, with deeper color palette and slightly more responsive controls. Other than that, there really isn't much of a difference. In 1993, Namco released their own version of Miss Pac-Man for the NES. This version of the game was a straight-up port from the arcade game, without any of the bells and whistles tacked on from the Tengen versions. This was also the first actually licensed versions of Miss Pac-Man on the NES. One of the reasons this game is great is because you can finally see an accurate maze of the screen all at once, and this was done by drastically reducing the maze and sprite size. This would almost be a perfect port of the arcade version, but it runs drastically slower than the arcade version. The game unfortunately runs so slow that it's not really as fun as any of the other versions. A Game Boy port of the Namco version was also released in 1993. The game is pretty good for an early run Game Boy game, however it does have the issue of being far too zoomed in, which was rampant for Game Boy games of this era. Today, Pac-Man is available on almost all modern consoles, PC, and mobile devices, but of all these old ports of the game, I find that the best overall is the Super Nintendo version, which has the most packed into the game, and has the most modes, as well as the best graphics. While you can't see the entire maze at once like in the arcade version, it never really becomes a problem, although I would have liked to have the option to see the entire map all at once. The SNES port isn't the most faithful port to the arcade version, but then again, none of these ports really hold up in comparison. Overall, it does offer the best graphics and handling of all the early ports, which makes it my pick for the best of the retro Miss Pac-Man ports.